In slides on palliative management, we have gone over systemic causes, root causes, and solutions. And in these slides, we will go over what we mean by root causes, what patterns emerge, and what solutions are usually recommended. So we have a lot of talk about systemic flaws in the slides on palliative management. So let's go over those and how systemic problems can create individual psychological issues. Let's begin with a little definition of systemic concerns. Systemic concerns are misguided, flawed systems and processes. These processes can be cultural or social norms, even established institutions. Sometimes they are just unfortunate environmental factors which result in systemic policies which are harmful or injurious. Let's look at an example of a well-intentioned social norm which may result in systemic issues. So a classic example is from ancient Rome. The Roman censors would fine you if you did not have children. The societal norm was to have children. This desire to put social and institutional pressure to reproduce obviously created a lot of problems for the Roman Empire. Today we know that overpopulation and overcrowding can have a host of deleterious effects on human psychology and physiology and health. If a citizen is injured physically or psychologically, it can create a host of expenses and problems for the larger nation. Unplanned reproduction without care for available resources can do and still do bring down empires. Besides overpopulation and overcrowding, there are environmental factors like poverty and pollution, which can result in a host of psychological and hence social issues. So systemic flaws, as we explained, can cause real social problems, but they can also cause psychological trauma. Psychological traumas can result in psychological pathologies. These psychological issues are what we call the vices. For example, lack of empathy, lack of trust, and then there are the more traditional vices like the vice suffered by Gordon Gekko, who often says greed is good in the movie Wall Street. As mentioned previously, the pathologies can arise from structures that are part of a system. For example, if a censor in ancient Rome formally chastises and fines you for not reproducing, and you then end up reproducing and add to the overpopulation of the city, it is highly likely that the citizens of Rome and Italy will suffer from known diseases which arise from overpopulation. These diseases can be physiological, like colds, and much worse, like plagues, but they can also be psychological, like aggression, which is one of the many documented and known side effects of overpopulation. So the vices like the ones suffered by Gordon Gekko, like greed, can and may be acquired accidentally, like acquiring any disease. It's almost like catching a cold. Now, an example of acquiring a vice like Gordon Gekko's greed can be illustrated so. Suppose you encourage a poor person to save money, to economize, and to engage in wealth building and acquire wealth so they can live a good life. Now, this is for a poor person, and economizing and saving pennies is a good thing for him or her. Now, suppose that poor person walks by a wealthy person, and this drive to save money rubs off instead on a wealthy person who is already wealthy. What happens then? Well, economizing like a poor person, if you are already wealthy, is called miserliness, which is a vice. So frugality may be a virtue in one person, but the same frugality in a wealthy person may become the vice of stinginess or miserliness. For a wealthy person, the side effects of taking risks are cushioned due to their wealth, so they are expected to be liberal or generous with their wealth. But a poor person, if they are so generous, they may be accused of being profligate or imprudent prodigals or spendthrifts. So, as we illustrated earlier, that systems and well-intentioned processes within systems can result in psychological trauma or psychopathologies or vices. So, if a system demands an unhealthy act, it can even make the healthy folk unwell. For example, if a system demands that you guard a concentration camp, and even if you are even if you are initially opposed to standing guard over a concentration camp, you can soon become psychologically inured or immune or even indifferent to standing guard, because it is now a social and systemic norm. Then we want to explain that psychopathologies or vices can be infectious, particularly if you don't have a strong enough immune system built up, or immunity built up. If you are a healthy young doctor with a strong immune system, or if you are vaccinated, you may be able to tolerate some infectious diseases or psychological diseases. But most people are supposed to be innocent and thus vulnerable to psychopathologies or vices. And that is how we like people. We like people to be innocent and vulnerable. We don't want them to be constantly on guard and to be walking, talking, armored individuals. It is for these reasons we are urged to observe the sort of company we keep. It does not mean persecuting bad company. It just means avoiding bad company and letting bad company be reformed by the experts and doctors who may reform without doing harm. Once an individual is infected as a result of environmental factors, they can pass the infection on to others. For example, Gordon Gekko, due to a traumatic childhood, acquired the vice or pathology of greed. But Bud Fox, when he became Gordon Gekko's apprentice or subordinate and decided to emulate or imitate him, temporarily ended up engaging in acts that were similar to Gordon Gekko's. In the movie Wall Street, if Bud Fox did not have the immunizing, healing force of love of his family and from his dad, he may have succumbed to the pathology of greed like Gordon Gekko. Then we also know that pathological individuals may reinforce the necessity for systemic flaws. For example, as we outlined earlier, a misplaced frugality or greed may encourage the exploitation of low-cost labor. Low-cost labor, in turn, may be brought about by irresponsible reproduction, and the need for irresponsible reproduction and low-cost labor and to supply someone's greed may encourage governments penalizing population management, or systems and churches and social organizations penalizing population management and encouraging irresponsible reproduction and irresponsible growth. Lastly, you will repeatedly encounter the need for ensuring both inner, psychological, and systemic or external wholeness or health whenever we are discussing solutions for social or corporate concerns. So you will also notice a lot of slides identifying the root causes as systemic flaws. Going into the actual root causes will not be delved into in detail because most systemic flaws are so embedded into the system that they are normalized and they are not often viewed as flaws. As a result of normalization of systemic flaws, deconstructing them is extensive and hence out of the scope of this presentation. For these reasons, some of the systemic flaws mentioned here may seem unusual due to their being accepted as social norms. Usually, one of the issues with palliative measures is how these measures often end up becoming one of the root causes and becoming part of the systemic flaws. Now, we know that incorrect solutions to problems usually emerge from an inability to identify the root cause. For instance, most of Adam Smith's work in The Wealth of Nations identifies palliative measures which pass for regulation. Again, regulations are important. But what is better is to create an environment where regulations are unnecessary. If, however, you must regulate, it must attempt to tackle the root issues. If you must regulate, then you must, but it's an indication of inability to tackle the root issues, perhaps. Please understand that laws are, after all, a human attempt at exerting control over a situation over which we have not as much control as we would like. Now, we'll go over some of the palliative measures that may end up becoming systemic flaws. One of these measures is the marking, stigmatizing, or branding of people. It's also a form of race harm. Some of these palliative measures are increasingly obvious, like the modern day use of incarcerating the criminal element in punitive penal establishments. Such prisons with their suffering and improper company does not usually improve the incarcerated. And as you can see, it's a workaround, a palliative measure, which seems to have become part of the system, unfortunately. Some of the other palliative measures are afflicting suffering upon people, even afflicting impious thoughts and vicious inclinations, spiritual inclinations upon the subject of reform. Now, this is a practice in some religions, and there's scriptural evidence which may be quoted, but it's beyond the scope of this particular presentation. Again, there are passages which may be cited, but this reference ought to suffice. Now, for some more examples of normalized human institutions, which are palliative measures, which often end up creating problems in return and become part of the system of society, are one of these institutions, which is the institution of the nuclear family, which has become quite normal and has ended up causing one too many problems. A case in point is the work on amoral familism by Dr. Edward Banfield. It's a classic work in sociology and anthropology, and most people are encouraged to review it for the sake of being better human citizens and better human beings. Another of these institutions is the human institution of marriage, which was a measure created in response to kidnapping of women in the ancient world. Briefly speaking, marriage was created as a monopolistic institution, a lesser evil, and not preferable to bachelorhood as described in the Bible, at least in the New Testament. And deconstructing such institutions is warranted, but it is beyond the scope of this presentation, and it is encouraged to I encourage the viewer to explore this further. To describe some other root causes that are normalized or normal nowadays, one of the issues or root causes involves the divine prophecy that Eve would end up birthing children after the fall from Eden. Reproduction, particularly unmanaged, is rather unsustainable where we have increasing demand with supply limited by natural resources, and we will go over this in detail in the following slides. However, even childbirth is a workaround, a way of continuing the human race after the arrival of death or human mortality. If mortality itself is a workaround, then the harbinger of death, which is disease and other human maladies, are measures to correct what needs addressing at a fundamental level. Diseases, in turn, have spawned a host of other palliative measures, illustrating that palliative measures may become normalized and even systemic. So we notice here that palliative measures seem to have a similar nature as falsehood or speaking untruths or a lie. A lie is self-perpetuating in the sense that you often need more lies to cover up the original lie. Similarly, with palliative measures, they become not only part of a system, you need more and more palliative measures to compensate for the original palliative measure. Lastly, while womankind was prophesied to birth children, mankind was afflicted with labor in order to nourish himself. Obviously, manual labor is a solved problem in today's world, since most people do not have to labor in order to be fed. This means that humankind may move to address other root causes. Incidentally, there is a relationship and a feedback loop that exists between some systemic flaws, particularly childbirth and manual labor. We will go over this relationship when we discuss reforming labor in the upcoming slides. So you will notice a lot of slides tracing the problems and digging deeper and deeper till they identify as many systemic flaws, incorrect motivations, and practices as possible. Eventually, though, it comes down to human inclination, and the solution is not just giving people good inclinations and a good spirit, but also a good environment. You see, a holy and wholesome spirit is certainly needed, as is obvious. But what do we mean by that? By a wholesome spirit or healthy spirit, we mean this, that even the thought of vice does not occur to the subject. In other words, even the thought of anything impious does not occur to us, even to a single individual. In other words, the subject is innocent of evil or does not even recognize evil when they see it. The state is akin to the state enjoyed by Adam and Eve, who, much like children, did not know that they were naked, and they were ignorant of even the difference between good and evil. Now, by a wholesome and healthy spirit, we also mean that only wholesome, good, and healthy thoughts occur to the individual, and this helps maintain the state of innocence. Lastly, we also ask for a holy and wholesome exterior environment. When we ask for a holy or wholesome exterior, we mean a wholesome exterior environment. We're asking for an environment any without any negative triggers, without any trauma, without any traumatic triggers like toxicity and pollution or other incentives to impiety. We already know that external pollutants, viri, and bacteria can cause both physiological and psychological or spiritual harm or psychopathy. So what we ask for is a combination of both inner and outer health. And we ask that it be considered rather important in any rehabilitative environment. Now, if you're wondering about the efficacy of a wholesome spirit in a wholesome environment, a holy interior and exterior, then look no further than modern medicine. We are evolving and improving the art and science of medicine, but you'll observe that a patient at a hospital is given both a clean, hygienic exterior environment as well as sweet medicine for interior healing. In conclusion, when we go back to the main slides discussing various techniques and ideas and concepts, I hope when we speak of the root causes, it is a little bit clearer to the audience. I hope we all have a great life. Thank you for listening.